Good evening, everybody. Right, boys and girls, before we begin, must remind everybody that this story is strictly for mature audience members only, not suitable for viewers who are under the age of 18 or for anyone with a sensitive disposition. And see, I even remembered to put my mic on this time. I'm getting better. If you're new at the channel and you like what you see, then yeah, I did write all this out by the way before. Nobody says anything because I'm sick and tired of mincing my words to start with. If you're new at the channel, like what you see, hit the follow button so that you can see whenever I go live. I don't just do stories, I do play games as well. If you've missed any of the hey Solus, if you've missed any of the previous stories, they are available. Thank you for the follow, Solus. Really appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Modman. If you like any of the stories and you want to catch up, jump over to YouTube. Well, it's actually not on the page, but Buckybird, you'll find me there. All stories get uploaded on a Tuesday. Now, if you're watching this later on YouTube and you haven't already done so, please hit the subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and then you'll always know whenever I upload. Feel free, by the way, if you think anybody else would be interested in my stories, to share them with your friends. Hey, kiddo. Thank you, Mr. Modman. Right. I don't know why that's not on there. That should be on there. I'll need to add that. Also, I need to raise the camera a bit. Right. So, tonight's story. It's an interesting one. No, the story I originally intended in doing. Because me being the complete moron that I am, I had a story in mind. And it's a story I've known all my days. I had it in mind. But I got my castles muddled up. You know, there's a lot of castles in Scotland. And I got them muddled up. So, several hours into researching what I thought was the right castle, turned out it was the wrong one. And I thought, well, I ain't wasting all that time research. I'm just going to run with this story. Because what I did find out about the wrong castle, really dark and unsettling. And it fits in perfectly here, I'll be completely honest. And if you got the notification for this stream, you kinda ken where this is going. The original story, by the way, I'm doing next week. Which should have been last week, but I took the week off, then it should have been this week, but then I got them muddled up, so it'll be next week that I do the original story. Which, if anybody remembers, a couple of weeks ago I said it may or may not contain an animal of an unusual colour. And that is still the case. That story is going ahead next week. So, buckle up, boys and girls, because we're about to go down a very dark and twisted rabbit's hole. Yeah. Flaming Siggy keeps going up. Right. Designed by Robert Adam and built between 1772 and 1790 for David Kennedy, the 10th Earl of Castley. Nobody ever believes that story, but it is documented. And I will be telling that story next week. So, Culzean Castle is a beautiful castle that is just outside of Maybole, South Ayrshire, and just 22.5 miles from Ginger Army HQ. Yay, we're back in Ayrshire. How come these stories always happen on our doorstep? I've pointed this out before, and it always seems to end up down this end of Scotland, in the southwest of Scotland. It always happens. It's like, really? But it's a very popular attraction. Most schools in the area take classes to it regularly. It's also popular with youth clubs, churches and other organisations. Set in around 650 acres, the castle boasts of woods, benches, parkland, swan pond, deer park, cliffs, can't even speak right, and its own large play area. It's easy to see why this historic venue is so popular. It even gets rented out for weddings and other private functions. Although the prices are a bit on the steep side, and the castle itself is only open to the public from the beginning of April to the end of October, that doesn't stop well over 250,000 visitors turning up every year. So it is a popular building. Now, like I said, it's popular with schools, and anybody that grew up in the 80s, 90s, early 90s, went to school in Ayrshire, has been to Culzean Castle. Several times. It seemed to be the go-to for the school summer trip. That and the castle that will feature next week. Now, obviously, this isn't a nice story, because if it was, I wouldn't be telling it, because that's not what I do. Now, so the facts and statistics about the castle are out of the way. Let's get on to the good stuff, shall we? It's said that at least 7 ghosts haunt the castle, and given its dark history, it's not really surprising. On a wall just outside the kitchen, there is a long list of names, and those names were the servants back in the glory days of the castle. And by servants, I mean slaves. And at the top of that list is a name that stands out. The name Scipio Kennedy. Now, the story of Scipio Kennedy starts in 1694, when a boy whose birth name is unknown was born in West Africa. The first 5 or 6 years of the boy's life are lost to history, but we do know that in 1700 the boy was stolen in Guinea and sold into slavery. He was sent to a Caribbean island, and the slave traders in the Caribbean were nothing short of torturers. And the slaves they sold usually ended up working on the sugar plantations in the West Indies. Now, back at the beginning of the 1700s, sugar was a big thing. They just looked... They just discovered that sugar could be used as a sweetener, and everybody wanted it. And it fetched a fair price. Luckily, now I use that term loosely, because let's remember, this young lad was still stolen and sold into slavery pretty much as soon as he could walk and talk. But luckily, that wasn't what fate had in store for this little lad. And he was bought by a Scottish man named Captain Andrew Douglas of Dumbartonshire, who was most likely purchased to be a personal or household servant That was often the case for young African males, and having slaves or footmen of this nature was a status symbol and a sign of great affluence. So if you had a little black boy running after you, you were seen to be well off. So many fucking things wrong with that. I mean, even just saying it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. In 1702, oh, thank you, Mr. Modman. In 1702, 2 years after he was taken from his home in Africa, this young boy first set foot in Scottish soil. So he was so taken in 1700 and it took him 2 years to get to Scotland. Now, the origin of the lad's name are not entirely known, but Scipio is neither African nor Scottish. It is in fact Latin and most likely came from Douglas during the 2 years he owned the lad. Now, slave owners often named their slaves, they renamed their slaves, Latin names. Now, I find this absolutely disgusting, but they were named after great Latin heroes, so to speak, men of great affluence, great intellect, highly respected, as a form of humiliation, a reminder of what they will never be, because they were nothing more than slaves. And that's just wrong. Scipio went to work for Douglas's daughter, Jean, who was the wife of David Kennedy, owner of Culzean Castle. Now, it's believed that Scipio, this young lad, was given to Jane and her husband as part of a dowry, where he was basically paying David Kennedy to take his daughter's hand in marriage. Young Scipio worked as a slave until 1725, when he converted to Christianity and was given his freedom as a reward. Yeah. He continued to work for the family, but he was paid a wage. And 3 years later, in 1728, he married a local lass by the name of Margaret Gray, and the newlyweds were gifted land and property inside the grounds of Culzean Castle, where they went on to raise a family of around 8 children. And he lived out his life working for the Kennedys, earning the money with his wife, and his children, and he lived there until, I believe, mid-1770. So his story had a happy ending, so to speak. I mean, he was still stolen and sold. Sorry, I dropped my lighter. I don't know why I try and smoke during these stories. So, Scipio's story, it's not the worst slavery story, but it's still not very nice. But he was on that boat for 2 years, coming from the Caribbean to Scotland. 2 years. And in that 2 years being on that boat, a lot of adults that were on that boat died because of the poor conditions. They were overcrowded, underfed. It was disgusting. And it's not known who cared for the little lad, because remember, he was only 5 or 6 years old when this happened, when he went onto this ship. And he was around 8 by the time he finally arrived in Scotland. So he was on this ship with all these other slaves, and a lot of the adults never survived the trip. I mean, 2 years at sea with very little food and barely enough room to stand on below decks, because it was a slaver ship. They were treated appallingly. But he survived. He made it to Scotland, to a country where he couldn't speak the language, didn't know what was happening. But at least he got a happy ending. He worked as just under 20 years he worked as a slave. No, just over. I need to learn to count. Just over 20 years. And he got his freedom. And he got married. And they had babies. And they had their own property. So, the Kennedys, by and large, were good to this kid. Unfortunately though, others weren't as lucky as him. But at least Scotland saw common sense, I guess, and abolished slavery. Well, started the process of abolishing slavery in 1778. Now, on to the ghosts of Culzean Castle. As I said before, there's at least 7 that have been reported. Kinda creepy. Now, one of the most famous ghost stories connected to Culzean Castle is that of the Piper, who together with his dog was sent into the caves below the castle. Back into caves, like seriously, stay away from caves, people. He was to work his way from the entrance below the castle to an exit on the hill some distance away to prove to local residents that the caves weren't haunted. The story goes that the Piper started skittling at the foot of the cliffs and entered the caves, followed by his loyal companion. The howling of the pipes could be heard from inside the castle, high above the top of the cliffs. As the howl started to fade, people assumed the Piper was making his path through the caves. But then the piping stopped. and occasional barks from the Piper's dogs. Stopped. No one emerged for the cave's exit. Oh, thank you, Ollie. Assuming he might have got stuck, a party went to search for the Piper, but to no avail. The Piper and his dog were never seen or heard from again. Or were they? Local legend says that on the eve of a Kennedy family wedding, the sound of pipes can be heard emerging from the caves below the castle, and a lone figure can be seen standing on Piper's Brae. Let's prove to folk the cave's only haunted. Send a Piper and his dog in, and they'll end up haunting the castle. Well, that kind of backfired, didn't it? There are apparitions that supposedly wander through the castle. Sadly, there are few details as to who those spirits might be, though a young girl is said to run along the corridors close to the kitchen. Now, if you've been on a guided tour of the castle, you will pass through allegedly the most haunted room of the castle, the state bedroom on the first floor. There are also stories of ghosts, guests even, seeing a black or grey apparition ascending the stairs from the ground floor to the first. These stories have been taken so seriously that when the Most Haunted team visited the castle to film an episode, those were the two areas they chose to concentrate on. So even caught their attention. Gonna be honest with you, Yvette Fielding, Ghost Most Haunted, I don't pay much attention to them because I've caught them faking stuff. I've clearly seen on camera that they've been faking stuff. Ghosts, I believe in what they claim. Nah, I think they're fake. But that's neither here nor there. They went there. Another story from the castle concerns one of the paintings at the top of the oval staircase. A portrait of Margaret Erskine of Dun, the wife of the 12th Earl of Casterly, later the first Marquess of Ailsa. I know we're getting a lot of Scottish places that nobody has any clue where they are. Other than Ailsa being it's an island, but off the southwest coast of Scotland. But on top of that, it's also a mental health hospital not far from here. I believe it is still operational, but not as much as it once was. Anyway, a number of the stories surrounding this painting. Margaret, look at Margaret's foot as you walk past and watch how it follows you. And if you look into her eyes and see what happens. One of the guests said that on occasion when the castle is quiet, a strange mist can be seen moving from one side of the stairs to the other. Its path always starts in front of the portrait of Margaret. So chances are that is Margaret. Yay! The Culzean Castle is most certainly a beautiful historic building, and it is now owned by the Scottish Trust. It was surrendered or handed over to them in 1945, I believe. and it should be preserved, but it doesn't really have a nice backstory. Several slaves were at Culzean Castle, and although I can't find out how many, it does seem that their lives were somewhat better than those who were sold to work on plantations. So there were slaves there, and the vast majority of them actually did not too bad in comparison, but they still owned people. That's not right. No, you don't own people. Why is my phone flashing? Look up. But yeah, they still owned people. I mean, it doesn't matter that they had a nice life in comparison to some of the ones that were sold, but not just that, there were quite a lot of the slaves that I found from Culzean Castle that were given their freedom. So, I mean, there is that, but they still owned slaves, and that's just, no. Just no, okay? And unfortunately, Scotland wasn't exempt from the barbaric tradition of slave owning. In fact, some Scottish owners were known for treating their slaves horrendously, and the vast majority of slaves, and I fucking hate that word, but the vast majority of slaves that came to Scotland never lived past 4 years. They were treated so horrendously. However, one thing that we can be proud of, I guess, is that we outlawed slavery 229 years before the rest of the civilized world. 229 years. I mean, in one aspect, you think a country that was owned by another country and their people were treated as slaves wouldn't want to own slaves. They would. I mean, Scottish history is littered with the injustices that happened, like the Highland clearances, and we were slaughtered in our thousands. We were stolen and traded as slaves for the English. And you would think a country that had survived that would be against slavery from day one. But we weren't. But we did wake up, I suppose, and abolished it 229 years before the rest of the world. So that's something, I guess. And all this started, the reason slavery got abolished in Scotland is because of a James Knight, who was a slave, and he was owned by I have that. Why do I not have that in there? Well, I'll cover that. I will cover that, don't worry about that. No, it was James Knight, who was a slave who won his freedom when the Court of Session in Edinburgh ruled Scotland could not support slavery. Now, this important precedent didn't mean that Well, the slaves were freed straight away. Didn't happen like that. But it did mean that no person in Scotland could be held by law as a slave. This was only in Scotland. This was not the case in England. Because let's face it, they've been enslaving people for centuries. They'd done it with the Irish, the Welsh, the Scottish. They weren't going to get their slaves as easily. Slave sales were banned in Scotland, although at times Scots had profited from bringing slaves into the country. In 1807, the slave trade in British colonies became illegal, and British ships were no longer allowed to carry slaves. So, yay. At least we're doing something, right? But that's not just Scottish ships, that's British colonies by 1807. So at least the rest of Britain's following suit. However, complete abolition... Why do I keep putting big words in these? Of slavery did not come until 1833. The Glasgow Anti-Slavery Society was formed in 1822, and the city was known as one of the staunchest abolitionist cities in Britain. So Glasgow was the big anti-slave. Why did I not just write that? Why did I do this? It was the city that Mace said, nope, not doing it. No more slaves. Many well-known Scottish public figures throughout history have owned slaves, with some 34 prominent figures being slave owners, including a friend of Robert Burns, who himself was against slavery. Just want to point that out. Now, Robert Burns, I'm going to cover him at some point because he was not a fucking nice man, okay? I don't care what they say, he was not a nice man. But he was against slavery, and he wrote poems about it. There's also a lot of other things, and I will cover that. Not tonight. I mean, the crap on him, that's a two-parter at least. But he was against slavery. But his friend profited. His friend owned sugar plantations. You can imagine how much he loved slaves. Making him a fortune. As many as 60 to 80 slaves were in Scotland at any one given time. Now, in the grand scheme of things, 60 to 80 in a country this size, not that big. But the point is, we were still owning human beings. Like, no. Just no, okay? Do better. Oh. Now, the beginning of the end for slavery came, like I said, because of one Joseph Knight. And he took his owner, John Wedderburn of Ballandine, Perthshire, to court and fought him for his freedom, and he won. And that one case, Joseph Knight, which, by the way, obviously not his own name, but a name that had been given to him by his master, owner, whatever you want to call it, neither one sounds right. They both, they both taste wrong in the mouth. They leave a bad taste in the mouth. No, you don't own people. No. So, how a ghost story about a haunted castle became a story about the horrendous practice. Hey Charlie, I'm good, thanks, how's you? Of owning people as slaves was really anybody's guess. But that's what happens when you work in these stories. You start researching one thing, leads you to another, and then another, and you go for looking for a funny coloured animal to being the other side of Ayrshire, learning about pipers and their dogs going missing, trying to prove the non-existence of ghosts. They become ghosts themselves, to slaves and slave trade in the 1700s. It's nuts. And honestly, it is. I mean, started off looking for a funny coloured animal. Ended up. Aww. Well, hopefully you can make the later one, man. I still desperately want to go. I mean, Wales Comic Con, it's... They get some amazing people. They got Bruce Campbell and Brad Dourif, okay? They're like... Oh, they're right up here, you know? And they've got the whole of Torchwood. And quite a few Buffy cast members. And quite a few for Doctor Who as well. So, like, really, that's... Wales is pretty spectacular. And the Telford takeover, they're amazing. My phone is flashing again. Oh my god. That tends to happen though. I think that a lot of people want the same time off, because 9 times out of 10 they've got the same thing that they want to go to, or you're a specific week of the year's cheaper to go on holiday and on the other week, and everybody wants it all off at the same time. So I'm glad I don't need to do any of that anymore. It used to be brutal to try and get time off work in the middle of summer. Can't I work this weekend? Sorry, I'm going to the other side of the country to work and get drunk in a field. Yeah, they kind of frown upon that. Especially when everybody else is wanting time off to go on summer holidays with their kids. Yeah, I don't know. Right. So, anyway. I guess we're lucky in the sense that owning people as if they were livestock isn't something that we've experienced in our lifetimes. It was abolished before any of us were born. And thankfully it's something we never will experience, because we'll know... I want to say we're better educated, but... The thing is, these people that owned slaves, they were wealthy, well-educated people. So it's not that we're better educated. We just know that owning people is fucking wrong. Okay? It's just, no. Don't buy people. No. I mean, these people, they actually believe that these rich white people believed that they were better and could treat these people like absolute garbage, could buy and sell them, could trade them purely based on the colour of their skin, and that, no. They genuinely believed that they were better, higher up in the food chain, because they were a different colour. And the sad thing about it is, yes, as a species we have evolved past that, but there are still some people out there that believe that. Luckily, they're in the minority now, but and to be fair, I'm no stupid, I'm no naive. I know that in some countries slavery still happens. I mean, we still have sweatshops and things like that, but in civilised society, not even civilised, but first world, it's not really that much of an issue. I mean, yes, the rich and powerful still have servants in a sense, but no slaves. They have maids and housekeepers and butlers that are paid a living wage to do the job that a couple of 100 years ago would have been somebody that they bought, that they legally owned, that would do that job for free. They wouldn't get paid to do it, they would be made to do it. If you don't do it, you will be beaten and you will not be fed. And that's disgusting. And like I said, there are still the minority of people who do still think like that, but the majority of people have evolved, thankfully. So yeah, I started out looking for a particular ghost story from my childhood and ended up elbow deep in slave stories. Now, I'm glad, set that down now. I'm glad that we've evolved as a species and we don't buy and sell people. I mean, yeah, human trafficking in sweatshops and that's still a thing, and that's messed up. But when compared to a couple of 100 years ago, we're doing better. We've still got a long way to go. Because like I said, there are still people out there that unfortunately think that people that are a different colour from them are somehow lesser humans, or are a lesser class, or of lesser value than them. And that's just messed up, but luckily it is the minority of people that think that. And we don't go and steal children from West Africa and sell them into slavery, where they might get lucky and end up in a stately home where they're footmen or house servants. But the vast majority, these poor children, the ones that made it to adulthood, lived horrendously. They were barely fed. They worked in fields doing jobs that were deemed so meaningless. They were necessary, but they were so beneath the master and men of the same colour as him that they stole and bought people and forced them to do the jobs instead so that they could get rich. And I'm so glad it was before our time. I really am, folks, because let's face it, that shit's just no nice. It doesn't bear thinking about. It really doesn't. It doesn't sit right with me, and it's just one of the things. I knew that, and like I said, I'm no naive. I knew that there was slavery in Scotland to an extent, but I didn't think it would be to that extreme, to the point that Scottish slave owners were known as being some of the worst. Yeah, David Kennedy and his wife, by all accounts, were, I want to say, pretty decent to their slaves and later their staff, because they didn't treat them horrendously. They did give them their freedom, albeit at a price. They had to convert to Christianity because, otherwise they were lawless savages for some unknown reason. But some of them, most slaves had a life expectancy of 4 years once they came to Scotland, because the owners here were so bad. It doesn't bear thinking about what those poor people went through. That's just not right at all, man. Right. But I'm going to leave it there for tonight. But luckily, like I said, we have learned from our mistakes. And we can just keep growing and keep evolving. Now, it's not a nice history lesson, but if I'm telling the story, it's not going to be nice. Or else it wouldn't be called Scotland the Grave, the darker side of Scottish history. But all we can do is, right, yes, it is a horrible part of Scottish history, but we shouldn't just forget about it. It happened, it shouldn't have happened, but it did. And Scotland set a precedent again in abolishing slavery. Bit embarrassed that we owned slaves in this country in the first place, considering everything we'd been through as a nation, but we led the way when it came to making things better. And we need to remember that, and we need to stop trying to rewrite history and stop forgetting about it. Because yeah, it's no nice. But we're not going to learn from our mistakes if we write over the top of them with sunshine and rainbows. Because it wasn't. Right. But next week, So like I said, I'm going to leave it there for tonight, because that was quite a heavy story that should have started off as a multicoloured animal. Next week we'll go back to the story I originally started researching, and fingers crossed it doesn't take a dark turn like this one did. Next week's story is going to be... well, I'm talking about multicoloured animals, for God's sake, and ghosts. But next week's story is more light-hearted. Or at least that's my hope going into it, right? But to be fair, anything could happen. I mean, I could go down this route and find out that this animal I'm trying to find out used to belong to Hitler. I don't know. I very much doubt that would be the case. But anything's possible. But I guess we'll find out. And I guess I'll find out when I start researching it. But like I said, I'm hoping to keep it light-hearted and kind of humorous to an extent, and get to the bottom of this mystery that's been perplexing me since I was a child. I mean, I must have been about 7 or 8 when I first heard this story, and and I can remember it clearly, walking through this castle as a child and just being amazed by it, the relics and the architecture and the beauty of this castle. Quite similar to Culzean Castle. And I remember hearing this story, and the woman that, as she was walking us round, was telling us this story. And I thought she was over fucking head. I actually thought she was making this up as we went along. And then more and more people, including Kiddo, get told this story, and other people know this story, and no one knows where it comes from. So I'm going to try and get to the bottom of this story and find out where it came from, and hopefully it will be a bit like more light-hearted. I mean, it's still a ghost story about a very old castle, but let's try, please, fingers crossed, that it doesn't lead down a dark and twisted road with dead pipers and their dogs and haunted paintings. And although haunted paintings are kind of cool, I'm not going to lie, but slavery and a list of slaves' names outside a kitchen walkers, that's just depressing, man. It's just... no. So, we're aiming for light-hearted. So fingers crossed I don't find anything untoward with this next castle. Shouldn't do that, you know, my hands are just enough as it is. But I'm going to call it a night there. Thank you everybody for joining me and for your continued support. Really does mean a lot to me that the same names keep popping up every Sunday when I'm here. Really do appreciate it. Cheers, Kiddo. Mr. Modman. That ruined mine too if I found out something dark and twisted about this story. See if I can do this from here. Or not, because it's not letting me type. There we go. Right. Yay, Moobot's back. I love having my commands back. Right, so I will be back on... Not a problem, Mr. Modman. Night, kiddo. You too. I'll be back on Tuesday night. Will I? Yeah, I will be. Don't know what I'm playing yet, but I'll find out. But I'll be back on Tuesday night. Mr. Modman link in the chat. We'll be back on... You'll be back tomorrow night. Don't know what's streaming. Guess we'll find out when we find out. We'll find out when he figures out 5 minutes before he goes live at 8 o'clock. Like I said, I'll be back next Sunday. But until then, I will catch you all the next one. Look after yourself. Be good to each other. Stay safe. Bye bye now.